Was there someone unlucky enough to witness all three sacks of Rome in the 400s? It is a fascinating notion to think that there might have been some people who witnessed the entire 80-year span of the fall of the Western Roman Empire firsthand, so to speak, and who were in the midst of all the chaos. Was there someone who witnessed the entire dissolution of the Western Roman Empire? Someone who was born where the empire was still stable and who died after the last Western Roman emperor was abdicated. Let's try to think if that might have been possible and what such an unlucky person living in Rome in the 400s would have witnessed. Imagine you are born in the year 400 AD. In that year, everything looked excellent for the Roman Empire. Sure, there were lots of problems to deal with. The Roman Empire always had problems. There were problems even during the Pax Romana, such as the Jewish revolt, the incursions of the Picts, or the storm of the Marcomanni. There were incredible problems in the crisis of the 3rd century when the empire almost fell. There were problems in the 4th century when the borders of the empire were already threatened and when the disasters of Adrianople and Frigidus River happened. And yet, if we look at a map in the year 400 AD, we would be surprised to find that the borders of the Imperium were still intact. Britain was still under Roman rule. The border defenses along the River Rhine were still intact. Not a single Germanic tribe had established a realm in the Western Roman Empire. There was absolutely no reason to assume that this would change. In the east, the rebellion of Tribigild and Gainas had been quelled in the year 400, and the Goths had been expelled from Constantinople, ending that dangerous incident where the east came pretty close to being overthrown by the Goths. In the west, the Magister Militum Stilicho, the protector of Rome, was active, and as long as he lived, the Germanic tribes would have no chance to overrun Rome. So being born in the year 400 AD, the situation would not have seemed a lot worse than before. Business as usual in the Roman Empire, just another time of crises. But there was no hint whatsoever of what was to come. Similar to how the Europeans in the early 1900s had absolutely no clue of what horrors were to come in the next decades, a Roman born in the city of Rome around the year 400 would have thought that the Roman Empire would last forever. Roma Aeterna. The city of Rome itself in that year still had an incredible population of 800,000. Sure, a few people had left for Constantinople after the year 326 AD, when the Emperor Constantine had proclaimed a new capital in the east, which would be the New Rome. Sure, many artisans, many craftsmen, many senators, aristocrats, many prefects and statesmen had left for the east, sensing new opportunities in that new city, a fresh start, so to speak. Yet only 20% of the population of Rome left. Rome was only down 200,000 inhabitants from its peak population of 1 million some 100 years earlier during the reign of Maxentius. The city was still as awe-inspiring as ever. The grand old temples, the old monuments and buildings, all standing unspoiled since hundreds of years. Ancient history all around. It really seemed as if Rome, the city itself, would stand forever unchanged. A person born in 400 in Rome would have had no reason to believe otherwise and to have a foreboding of what was to come. Things started going south in 406 AD. The Magister Militum Stilicho had defeated Radagaisus and his giant armies twice, defeating him a final time in that year, thus eliminating this threat once and for all. He had also defeated the scourge Alaric, forcing him back to Illyricum. But late in that year, or in early 407, a large band of Germanic tribes managed to overrun the weakened border defenses along the Rhine River and managed to break into Gaul. I spoke in this video here why they could achieve this. In the following 2 years, things spiraled out of control quickly. Some poor decisions by the reigning Western Emperor Honorius led to the downfall of Stilicho, where the protector of Rome himself was killed on orders of the emperor. Sure enough, in that same year, Alaric, who as long as Stilicho had lived would have never been able to threaten Rome, was immediately back on the scene and now threatened the Eternal City itself. Had you been born in 400, you would have been a child of 8 years when Alaric first threatened Rome. Nobody saw that coming. In 406, everything still looked so good, and only 2 years later, here you would be in the Eternal City, Rome, Caput Mundi, the mother city that had not been sacked in 800 years, under siege. In 410, the city was then sacked for the first time in 800 years by Alaric. As a child, you would have taken refuge with your parents in one of the city's sanctuaries or churches, possibly at St. Peter's Basilica, because the Visigoths by that time were already Christians, and so the sack was unusually moderate for these times, and most people were spared. The city was looted for only 3 days, the damage to the city itself very modest, and the killing itself very limited. Thus, the chance that you would have survived this was pretty high. After the sack, many of the people that were wise enough to see this coming and who had fled were returning to Rome. Already a few years later, most of the damages had been repaired, and already 20 years later, nothing really reminded anymore of the sack of 410. So you would have stayed in Rome, your birthplace, the place of your ancestors, where your family also was. You would have stayed because why leave now? The fortunes of the empire were improving again after all, were they not? The Germanic tribes were given lands, yes, but in return they were obliged to defend Rome. Were they now not foederati of the empire? So you would have stayed in Rome. And if you are a Rome nerd like me, and chances are pretty high that you are if you are watching this video, then you might be interested in the incredible rings and other Roman accessories which the SPQR Shop is building. They make legionary rings, they make rings with different themes, they even make coin replicas, statues, pendants, attributes and terracottas. And the most incredible thing is that they handcraft every single piece. That's right, this is really high quality handcrafted material. There's really no better present for yourself or someone you know who might be a Rome fan. I put the link to their shop in the video description and into the pinned comment, and with this link you can get a 10% rebate on every purchase if you type in the rebate code Maiorianus. So go and check out their assortment, it's really quite incredible. In the 430s, you might have heard news of the Vandals marching into Africa. But their progress was slow, and as of that time, grain supply to Rome was still secured. In 439, you would have heard the news that Carthage had fallen. A blow for the empire, yes, sure, but the Vandals had promised to continue grain shipments to Rome, and Sicily was now being cultivated as a replacement for grain shipments, so that the grain ships were still coming unabated. In 450, you would have been around 50 years old. Not an unusual age for Romans of those times. Child mortality was very high, indeed, and thus life expectancy was quite short on paper. However, if a Roman had survived a certain age, chances were actually not too bad to reach 60 years of age or older. The Emperor Tiberius was almost 80 years old when he died. Other Romans, and especially the old Greek philosophers, had managed to live well into their 80s or even early 90s. So having a long lifespan was not impossible in those days, even though of course the odds to reach such an age were low. In early 455, nothing would have hinted at the troubles ahead. Now sure, the Magister Militum Aetius had been killed, you saw his body yourself exposed in the Forum Romanum, you had been to the Forum many times. But then you heard that the emperor himself was killed on the Campus Martius, not far from the Pantheon, while practicing archery. Petronius Maximus of the gens Annici and Petronii became emperor shortly after. Unfortunately, the Vandal king Gaiseric now saw the treaties with the former emperor Valentinian III null and void, and thus prepared a fleet to sail for Rome. In 455, we can reconstruct that Rome still had 500,000 inhabitants. This can be deduced from inscriptions of how much grain and meat was supplied to the city. Sure, this was a drop of 50% as compared to 150 years earlier, yet still, Rome was together with Constantinople and Alexandria still the largest city in the whole Roman Empire. Many people fled from Rome upon hearing of the Vandal fleet leaving from Carthage. You would have taken all your belongings and would have run as far away as possible. You heard the news how the emperor was killed in that sack and how the city was looted for 2 weeks. You remember the sack of Alaric in 410 as a child, but the stories of the Vandal sack are much more brutal. When all was over and the Vandal fleet left, you were one of those who would return to Rome. You feel a strong connection to the city, you have lived there all your life. You don't want to go to Constantinople, to those Greeks. You are a true Roman, not a Greek, so you return to Roma Aeterna. Upon returning, you witness some damages. The roof of the Temple of Jupiter has been torn down. Some buildings had burned. Many statues and other ornaments were stolen. Yet still on the outside, the city of your ancestors was still magnificent and in your eyes unrivaled, having no equal among all cities in this world. Now sure, you have heard stories that Constantinople, Alexandria and Antioch were also formidable cities, but in your mind, nothing compared to Rome. Damages could and would be repaired, you thought. And indeed, in the following years, the same as after the sack of Alaric, life went back to business as usual. Many of the damages were repaired, although this time not all. The state treasury was now emptier than 45 years earlier, and so some of the damages of the city were never repaired. The temple roof of Jupiter was left open as it was, and many who had fled Rome before the Vandal fleet arrived, indeed never returned. Many had really left for Constantinople. You see emperors come and go. You hear news about a new emperor, Maiorianus. He seems to be made of sterner stuff. With great joy you hear the news that the empire is expanding again. The Burgundians, the Visigoths and the Suebi were all defeated and are now again foederati to the empire. But you know that having hopes in these days has become dangerous. You might be disappointed, and indeed, this noble emperor too was killed, betrayed. Maybe it's the best not to have any hopes anymore for the Roman Empire, you might have thought. In 467, you would have been 67 years old. Your whole family still lived in Rome, even your grandchildren. Even after all this time, there was still something in Rome which made you and your family stay. A new emperor had been sent from the east, someone called Procopius Anthemius, a Greek. That is how far it has come now. But he seems to be a decent emperor. Maybe there is still hope after all for the West. Only a few years later, these hopes would have been quashed. You heard the news that the Magister Militum Ricimer was now marching on Rome with a barbarian army. Not again, you thought. This time even with a slight cynical amusement. You sure could not be so unlucky to live through 3 sacks of Rome now, could you? Nobody in the whole universe could be that unlucky. At least you don't know anyone. But then again, at the age of 72, most of your old friends are dead. And the ones that aren't have moved away long ago. Even old Faustus now lives in Constantinople, that Greek traitor. You still exchange letters with him though from time to time. But you have to admit that he was an excellent rota player. So now at that age you are even too demotivated to leave the city. If this is a cruel cosmic joke, let the gods have their fun, you think. For you secretly still believe in the old faith, but that is something you better not tell anybody these days. You sit in your family house and hear about the siege of the city. There is scarce food supply, there is fighting. Ricimer has taken hold of the Transtiberinum. There was fighting at the old mausoleum of Hadrian, which Honorius had transformed into a fortress. You are too old to see these events for yourself. You sit in your old family domus, wisely having hidden supplies in a secret hideout beneath the floor. You don't have much left, and there aren't many valuables left in the old domus anyways. So you wait. You hear there's intense fighting going on. You sometimes see smoke rising on the horizon from your house, which is located on the Pincian Hill, near the old Pincian Palace at the Porta Pinciana. Then you hear the news that Anthemius was killed and that Ricimerus had won. I really don't like Greeks, you think, but that Anthemius, he was an alright guy. He didn't deserve this. Damn barbarian Ricimer. Those barbarians should never have risen to such power, you think. And then it is over. The troops leave Rome and a new emperor is proclaimed. You don't even care anymore about his name. The emperors come and go and you care less and less. The idea of empire seems distant to you. You remember it from your youth, but now it seems that the empire is dying together with you. When news reaches you that Odoacer has deposed Romulus Augustus, you think that maybe after all, this isn't such a bad thing. There's only one emperor now in the east, a Greek, but at least the empire is now reunited. Maybe that's how it should have been all along. Maybe it is now the new Rome's turn to rule the world. The old Rome had had its time. That old venerable city, bruised, yes, but still magnificent. The old monuments of the Caesars are still glittering in the sun on a hot summer's day. You remember though how full the streets were as a child. There were people everywhere, riches, silver, gold, wherever you would look. Now there are not that many people left, and riches less than ever. The streets are much emptier, the buildings older, weathered, some even crumbling. But maybe now that the empire is reunified under the rule of the emperor in Constantinople and governed by a barbarian Patricius, maybe now Rome would have peace, you think. And so if you would die in your 80s in Rome, you would have thus witnessed the so-called fall of the Western Roman Empire in its entirety. You would have witnessed the ravages that Rome had to endure. You would have witnessed the dissolution of the Western Empire. Yet in the final years of your life, you would have also witnessed the resurgence of Rome. There was peace now, stability, and Rome was, even though not as grandiose anymore, still the most impressive city on earth in your mind. And so yes, it is possible that someone would have lived through these events. We don't have surviving records of births because there was no centralized birth register in the Roman Empire, so we cannot know for sure when people were born. We don't even know the exact age of Maiorianus or Antiquity when they died. We can only guess. But would it have been possible for a person to witness all these events? Yes, absolutely. Out of the hundreds of thousands of people living in Rome, the probability is quite high that there was at least one person that would have lived in Rome from the early 400s into the 480s. It is fascinating to think about what change such a person would have witnessed. And please like and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating topic of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting my work on Patreon or via YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. And I would especially like to thank our new Augustus member, Lisa Hutchins. Thank you so much, Lisa, for upgrading and for your amazing support. Seriously, this channel would not work without our amazing Patreon and YouTube members. And I want to thank each and everyone who is supporting this channel in any form. Gratias tibiago amici. And if you want to learn more about how life would have been in Rome after the so-called fall, you can watch this video here in the upper right corner. But if you are more interested in learning how life would have been in Rome when it was reconquered by the Eastern Roman Empire, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.